U.S. overreach abroad. So we're going to zoom out a little bit. So I think, since January 3rd, the United States has acquired a new neo colony in the nation of Venezuela. So President Maduro still is sitting in a New York prison, while Delcy Rodriguez, his former vice president, is now the acting president. President Maduro is being held on drug trafficking charges, which I didn't know you could charge a foreign citizen with a U.S. crime, right? Like it's crazy. I think President Maduro, I think he pled not guilty, and described himself as a prisoner of war during his death, when he gave some testimony a couple weeks ago. But we haven't heard so much about how he's been doing, and I just think it's very it's really important that we put that how crazy that is, right? Like
Mm.
imagine if Vladimir Putin kidnapped Volodymyr Zelensky, right, and then just like held him in a Russian prison, right? Like internationally, we'd be the media would be going insane. And so, but going back on this neo-colony status, there's been some talk about the exiled opposition leader Maria Machado taking the presidency
Hmm.
with U.S. backing. But it appears the U.S. is going to back Delcy Rodriguez, the
Hmm.
former VP, because someone internal to the government right now is going to better control these different sections of the Venezuelan government, principally its military. And I think, that's important to really understand that this U.S. coup was fomented through assistance by the Venezuelan government, right? Everyone talks about the socialist, anti-imperialist government of Venezuela. Well, enough of these people were willing to cut a deal with the United States so that President Maduro is sitting in prison right now, right? And so Rodriguez is already implementing all these sweeping reforms. First of which is totally privatizing Venezuelan oil, as well as opening up the country to U.S.-led foreign direct investment. The U.S. is getting cuts of oil revenues now that they're selling internationally. And so I think that's the key thing here is that the Venezuelans, the United States was able to broker this deal with the Venezuelan government to create it into a neo colony without firing a shot inside of Venezuela, right? So the United States was able to bide its time and get actually the government itself to capitulate. Right. And so I think that's the big thing to understand about some of these different neo-colonial regimes, right? Or these different national regimes we see around the world. That without this clarity, we see the United States is really just able to cut deals with the ruling class at the expense of the Venezuelan population. Because the Venezuelan economy is only in the Venezuelan masses are only going to, suffer if like now all this oil revenue is going to be immediately privatized. They're only going to suffer more if U.S. companies are coming in exploiting the people. These sanctions that they've had to deal with for several years have been incredibly crippling. But the replacement is like a total lack of its own sovereignty. And let's be frank, that this whole relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela really got to its rockiest point, specifically because Venezuela wanted to open up Venezuelan oil to other imperialist powers, right? They wanted to let in Russian and Chinese oil companies in, and that specifically is what led to the sweeping U.S. sanctions and condemnations, not the so-called socialist government in place there.
Yeah.
Particularly when they try to deal with other imperialists, which is a direct violation of the U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine. The United States will be the dominant imperialist power in the Americas and no
Hmm.
one else, right? And so that's a key thing, right? And we see, them also widening that field now with what's going on with Cuba, you know, for the longest time, the United States has led a series of different blockades upon Cuba, but in recent years has lifted different sections of this isolation. But even now, they're threatening to add blockades of oil imports as another pressure on the Cuban government. So it seems like they're also trying to use this opportunity now to further expand their control. And it's not just there. We actually see what's going on in Iran, right? So initially, we have these different waves of these different demonstrations going on in Iran. Initially Trump was claiming that he was going to intervene in order to support the nonviolent demonstrators. Now he's claiming that he's calling for the dissolution of Iran's entire nuclear program, and if they don't do that, they're going to invade. So it's like they're really like clamoring they're really lining up the pieces as if they're going to do something in Iran. So I think this is something that we really need to pay attention to. The
Yeah. I
United States
mean,
has been moving troops through Iraq and Syria.
hmm.
It's pretty serious what's going on. And I think just the one thing about these nonviolent demonstrators, and I think that's really important. That while the sources outside of Iran have been pretty clear that there's something close to 5,000 people been killed in some of these demonstrations and counter demonstrations. But I think it's very important to understand that this is not just say like an Arab Spring type situation. That a lot of these like apparently like the stuff I've been looking to, there's been hundreds of police officers that have been like targeted and just like killed by so-called unarmed demonstrators who are clearly are armed. Right? There's been hundreds of mosques that have been burned down. Right? Like in targeted attacks. So obviously there are nonviolent demonstrations going on, but there's also a big section of actual like armed demonstrators that are going out and causing conflict out in the streets that the state is responding to. There's been all kinds of reports of possible involvement of Mossad, Israeli counterintelligence. And that's not just to say that every time that there's a disruption inside a non-aligned a country not aligned with the United States, it's all just Mossad, because that's actually falls upon some similar tropes we're not going to get into here. But it's very clear that this is not just the United States looking out for the best interests of the Iranian people. We've been looking at like a lot of the opposition U.S. media right now against the regime in Iran. It all goes back to the Pahlavi family, right? The former disgraced Shah of Iran, right? Who's been given shelter in the United States, whose family still lives in the United States, still very rich, and claiming that the Iranian people would welcome U.S. intervention, would welcome regime change. And this is something we've heard already. And so, we see these dominoes sort of in place. We've going on with Venezuela. And now it's being create these openings to further pressure Cuba. We have these motions around Iran, and that's not even before we get into Greenland. But I know you wanted to chime in, Dale. So before we get into that, but
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of like moving backwards a bit. The stuff with Iran is, I saw this a few weeks ago, and I would be surprised that the situation has changed since then. But they've had, Navy vessels off of the coast of Iran for some time now. Just ready to take advantage of the situation. And I think we're see, um, yeah, the protests themselves. There are people that are not happy with the government. There are people that do want a regime change. But there's also other actors in play in this. I feel like, as with anything, the ultimately the interests of the U.S. will look to do anything to destabilize a region. Even if there are some, organic elements to this discontent, they're also going to try and seed more discontent and division amongst people in these types of situations. So we'll see how it ends up playing out over time. Because I would be surprised if they're able to strike on Iran kind of similarly as they did to Venezuela. I yeah, the stuff with like Venezuela, it's like it's kind of miraculous in some ways how they're able to do like a one evening kind of like situation where they just come in and then take out the president and then are able to get a foothold into it. And there's still a lot to be figured out in this particular situation. Some of it's kind of hilarious. I think there was that whole instance with like the Exxon Mobil executive who was like, or the former Exxon Mobil exec who was basically just like, yeah, I don't know if we want to like reinvest here because like our assets have been seized so many times. And then Trump was basically just like, well, screw you. Like, you're not going to get a piece of this anymore. And a lot of those, some of the talking points that people are trying to like propagate around this stuff is this idea that it's like, oh, well, see, the thing about Venezuelan oil is it's like so much denser than other oils. So it'd be like really hard to deal with. So it's really a question. Is this really what they're trying to do? It's like, well, first of all, yes, this is what the government has been explicitly saying they've been trying to do. They're not trying to hide the fact that it's over like elections and stuff or like socialism. It's the fact that they want this oil. And not only that, like if you look at actually in the United States, like what oil production facilities look like, they largely subsist on a mixture of these different forms of oils, probably like 70%, these like kind of denser oils that are harder to refine, and these aren't things that you find in the United States. These are things that can only be gotten internationally. And so it's like the what this tells us is in direct contradiction with like what some of these other kind of narratives that are being put out there by these execs or by these like different rags that exist that are basically trying to spin these like economic narratives about it being more complicated than it seems. Ultimately they're in it for the oil. And even in the weeks before, in like a few days before Maduro was taken out of power, he was in discussions with the president in trying to figure out a way to fix things. But obviously, I think the thing was, Marco Rubio was definitely pushing for a more direct intervention, which they succeeded in, and then suddenly he was out of power. But that's interesting, the stuff about Rodriguez. I definitely need to read more up on this. I haven't really kept my finger on it as much, but
Well, yeah, I think it's the key thing, right? Because I think to say the United States invaded and kidnapped Maduro, I think is even like largely inaccurate. The United States cut a deal with a section of the Venezuelan ruling class to get the president to replace the president with a more pro-U.S. figure, which is this Delcy Rodriguez. It seems like it, right? And so it seems like that is the person that they're backing to like institute this new regime. We'll see how long she's able to stay in power because usually the first lackey ends up getting gobbled up by another lackey. So we'll see how that situation develops. But like I think we have these two sides of the same coin of how the U.S. will try to like intervene. Either they're going to try to like cut a deal with the ruling class, in the case of Venezuela, or they're going to try to actually have an overt like total invasion, like is what some of the sword rattling around Iran is about. But I think we have to all see these different things, like the events in Venezuela, the events in Iran, the threats toward Cuba, and even the stuff as Greenland, around as an overall continuum of U.S. overreach, of U.S.
mm-hmm.
imperialism, and not only that, but also U.S. inter-imperialist competition.
Yeah.
It's going back to the stuff around Greenland. And I think the first thing around like Trump's threat about Greenland is like we have to be very clear this isn't a real thing. What I mean by a real thing is that I don't like Trump is not seriously trying to fly troops out and occupy Greenland and make it into another neo colony. That's not actually what's going on. A couple weeks ago, I think Sweden, Norway, and Germany sent a total of 35 soldiers to Greenland as a show of force. I think if that doesn't tell you how serious they are about what the U.S. is saying, then I don't think what else will, right? Like they're clearly this is actually a threat. What I think what I mean is that Trump does not like expect to own Greenland anytime soon, but rather he's using this political threat in order to rattle NATO and EU members and bring them closer in line with U.S. policy, right? So he wants to tighten its grip. The U.S. wants to tighten its grip over the Arctic Circle because it doesn't want to compete with Russia and China over more fuel reserves
Mm-hmm.
and other shipping lanes and trade with Europe, right? And so right now, international leaders are looking at what the U.S. is doing in Iran and the Americas, and the threats to Greenland seem very legitimate, right? And so the choice is either some brutal takeover, some like U.S. sanctioning, or cutting a more pro-U.S. deal, right? And so but we should realize that this U.S. machine is very prone to overextension, and they're not the only imperialists in this game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the real risk the U.S. is facing now is further isolating itself when other powers like Russia and China have the ability to offer less aggressive terms, right? So it wants to dominate. The U.S. wants to dominate all these places, but it physically cannot occupy them all at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like we look back at Venezuela, the U.S. considered military action and acted out some limited military strikes, but overall, it waited until it could just unite with the right sellouts. So I don't think the United States is going to invade Greenland. They have been limited. Clear maneuvers. There have been limited. There's limited evidence that they're trying to do anything like that, right? So what the U.S. wants to do is wants to renegotiate its trade and political relations with EU members. And this threat, the threat is like cut a deal or be invaded, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
thing now is like, is the other powers like China, for instance, right? I was looking at some stuff with Politico, and like a lot of these different cables are going back and forth between U.S., EU, and Chinese leaders, or ambassadors, I should say, is over like what is this going to be? Like the EU doesn't want to cut ties with the United States, obviously, wouldn't, right, over these overtures. But if China is able to use this, that's the real question: is China going to be able to use this to actually build a closer relationship with the European Union? And what is that going to do for the international situation? What we've seen is like as historically, like when these different imperialist powers, as their competition increases, right, as one is able to gain up a leg over the other, it only increases international instability, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
then as the United States loses its position, it has no choice but to get more and more aggressive in other areas, right? So if Trump's gamble with Greenland ends up isolating the United States further from the European Union and allows for China to get in and build those relationships, well, then we're going to only see more Trump threats, more Trump militarism, more U.S. militarism.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the government's pretty ill-equipped to do another full-scale invasion, especially if it's place like Greenland. I think it makes a lot of sense to me, in particular how they're just trying to use this as a way to renegotiate these different trade agreements and such. Because I just don't see it as like a realistic thing at all that they could do all these things in succession, and be successful. For a number of reasons. I think part of it is they would be spreading themselves really thin. It would probably be the first time that there would be this type of intervention happening consecutively on this level. And I think part of it is like, I just don't even know if they have the manpower to be able to do it. I
Not
would,
this year.
yeah, not this year. It's like, I think just like enlistment levels probably aren't at the level that they've been in past decades. And it's a lot more difficult to drum up support to get people to join, although they'll do their best to go to college campuses and get some dude to do pull-ups and be like, you should join the Marines and whatnot. But I don't think that's going to be so successful, especially while there's all of this, stuff happening with ICE domestically.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that they might try and send over there, um, they're probably, acting as ICE agents, and they would probably actually have to be trained a little bit to go do this stuff, because realistically, like a lot of the tactics that ICE are using in particular, if they were to try to do this stuff in an active war zone, they would just get blown up.
Yeah.
It's not even a question. They don't even, a lot of these folks, lack the very rudimentary training that people in the armed forces would require. And this type of discipline isn't just going to, dissolve overnight just because, like, the president's like, oh, we need to shift all these people from this place to this place. It's like the military is the military. They have their shit figured out. There's a reason why they have these like standards and such. Even if they do really terrible stuff, they
And a terrible job.
then they do a terrible job. They still have certain standards, even if those standards don't meet the same level of ethics and morality as most people would. You know, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, like, if we go back to like with the stuff with Iran, so U.S. tension with Iran has been a thing in our U.S. foreign policy for over 50 years, right? So
Yeah.
both countries, principally Iran, has been preparing for U.S. invasion for almost 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Like all our simulations, the U.S. military simulations, is that it would be quite abysmal, right? It would be quite abysmal if the United States tried to occupy Iran the same way it's done to countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a very separate issue, right? I think I think they did the largest war simulation was over 15 years ago, and they estimated that something like 5,000 servicemen would die if the United States tried to invade Iran, right?
That was like the one they did during the Iraq War, right? So
Yeah.
that was like that was some time ago,
Some
but
time
it's
ago.
still pretty accurate.
Yeah, it's still fairly accurate. A time when the country's war readiness was more high. So what it means is that they're really hoping that they can foment some kind of internal collapse of the government rather than just invade. And if they can do that, then they would rather do that, right? Because just a complete frontal assault, they're not able to do that. Least of all, not to do it next week, next month, next year, even. Right. So I think it's important to understand we have to see the social unrest in that larger context of all these surrounding forces. And if we look more clearly, it's just like the present war in Palestine, right? With the Zionists have been sending almost as many missiles over to the surrounding Middle Eastern countries as they have been to Gaza, right? Particularly with countering missile strikes coming from Lebanon and Iran, right? These are pretty. This is the United States, the Zionists have been pretty clear that the next focus is on Iran, right? And so we really should see that the United States is really trying to arrange all these different dominoes around that calculus. But again, like this isn't just in a vacuum. They're not the only ones who are trying to improve their position internationally. There's also the Chinese government that's really trying to portray a U.S. aggression as justification for its own interference, right? And then the U.S. uses Chinese interference as a justification for over aggression. So we see how they one and one act together. So it's pretty dangerous stuff, and I think it's important that we understand that, particularly not falling into these sort of old Iraq War propaganda. As the United States, the peacekeepers of the world, and the United States need to be involved in this to protect the poor Iranians from their own government and give them a better government. We've tried the United States has tried that in Iraq, or not tried to do that, did something totally different in Iraq that was unsuccessful. Occupied Afghanistan for over 20 years and was overall unsuccessful. And was occupied Libya, was totally unsuccessful. Waged a war on Syria for several years, and was ultimately actually moderately successful with putting Al Qaeda in power there. This is only the basis for further bloody conflict, as long as like these imperialist forces are just out there running buck wild.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it is pretty scary stuff. But I think we have to see that that's why the need that we have to wage this anti-imperialist struggle. That's why like the competency of our own domestic movement is so important actually, so that we can actually educate people on what's going on around the world. Not just I mean educate Iranians on what's going on, but I mean educate American people what's going on. And it's like until we and so that's we actually have a very important responsibility as activists in the United States, that if we don't actually do something, the United States is going to continue doing awful things.
Pretty much.